There are more than 12 million square kilometers of land everywhere in the world that are affected by desertification. But unfortunately, the common perception is that desertification, desert, it's Africa. It's everywhere. It's the persistent, I think, loss of fertility of soil in dryland. And dryland are in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, and even in part of Europe.
Desertification is the very slow and silent process of the loss of soil fertility in very vulnerable ecosystem that we call arid areas. And that land degradation is impeding the ability of the soil to yield more crops and the ability of the population to live out of their agricultural work. That is why desertification has a strong linkages with poverty and a strong linkages with hunger.
Desertification means to me the faces of the women that have to fetch water and look for firewood when their environments are overused and overexploited. Desertification has a human face for the work that I do.
250 million people depend directly on dry lands. And when they're put at risk of desertification, more than 1 billion people could be indirectly affected.
Globally, drylands are providing to us 44% of our food production systems. 50% of the livestock in the world are coming from the drylands. So it's not about unproductive lands.
Desertification, when it happens in the drylands, has a major impact on the poor people who live in the drylands, because we all know that mostly it's the poor people who live there, and poor people have not a lot of capital, have not a lot of assets. So the moment, of course, they are affected by drought or by flooding, that means that this is a one-way ticket to absolute poverty.
Because if deserts encroach, it means people have to leave. They leave behind their home. They leave behind many times the breadth and depth of their culture, because they can no longer maintain much of that in a new environment.
Usually men leave their communities to neighboring countries or areas to search for a better life. Women are left behind, taking care of children, elderly and sick people, and facing all the bad and negative consequences that desertification has caused.
From the poorest, the women are the poorest, and that they are impacted in a different way, but they are incredible agents of change when it comes to combat desertification. In the case, for example, of Africa, it's very important to understand that women produce up to 70% of the food, of the staple food. That puts them in a contact and direct relationship with the land. So if you only provide training to the men, thinking that they are the heads of the household, without acknowledging, for example, the role of women in food production, you are putting the knowledge in the wrong hands.
I think in this whole action plan, what is very important is that we pay attention to what is happening at the local level. Action plans are not negotiated and implemented at the global level. At the end of the day, you need the ownership, the participation of the people who live on the ground, who are suffering from the desertification. They have to be involved, they have to have ownership. And that comes then to issues like land tenure. Very often the poor woman who lives on the drylands, she doesn't own the land. So how do you want her to care, for the land? How do you want her to spend the little resources she has, in planting some trees in order to prevent further erosion?
Farmers are in the front line in defending our environment. They take the decisions. We talk about policies, they talk about what actually happens in the field. Now, the key is that we have to encourage, by policies and incentives, what many call sustainable agricultural intensification. There's very little new land. We have to farm that land more effectively, use the water more efficiently to produce more food security per unit land.
By 2050, it is forecast that we will be 9 billion people on planet Earth. We will need by then to increase food production by 70%. And according to FAO, we will need, at least in the developing world, an additional 120 million hectares of arable land for agriculture. Where are we going to find them? we have two options. One is to encroach in the existing forest, and the second is to restore degraded land. The communities in the drylands are leading the innovation to address desertification. In the Sahel, for instance, you can see it in Niger, you can see it in Burkina Faso and in Mali, where you compare before 1983 and after 2006, you will see what have been called the regreening of the Sahel. This is a grassroots level movement for land restoration, land regeneration that is combining reforestation and agriculture that is called agroforestry techniques.
Reforestation should be done on a large scale in many instances. You know, done on a small scale, it's great, but many people plant a few trees. But what we're exploring is how to look at a very large area. And there's some very interesting experiences upon which we can draw to see what could make a difference. And I will tell you about one that was most significant. In China, they decided what they had to do was to reforest and redirect and rethink the whole ecosystem of an area that amazingly is the size of France. And what they did was that over a 15-year period, they transformed this area from just dirt, sand and dirt, to green and water, and they quadrupled the income of the local people, pulling them out of poverty. They created food, they had water, and they vastly reduced the silting.
Natural resources, including soil, are seen as an income, not as a capital. And we need to preserve these natural resources, be it oil, be it forest, be it marine, be it soil, be it dry land, as a natural resources, and we need to treat them as a capital. You have, as a businessman, you have to preserve your corporation, your factory, and therefore you have to maintain the machinery which will allow you to continue to produce goods. The same applies to natural resources.
In Niger, for instance, where overgrazing is one of the main causes of desertification, the cost of action, meaning to avoid overgrazing, assessed to be estimated at $200 per hectare in an average. The cost of inaction is up to $1,100. So here it is quite clear that investing in avoiding desertification and restoring degraded land is not a burden for public budget. It's rather a driving force for poverty eradication and inclusive, sustainable economic development.
What we need to do is absolutely, it's a condition, it's a prerequisite, is to break the wall between scientific knowledge, which a huge scientific knowledge is already existing. The knowledge accumulated for years by the NGOs, including the knowledge from the local population. And all this must be included in public policy in order to implement properly the activities.
Nowadays, we have all that it takes, science, technology, to build a land degradation neutral world. That's what is making me optimistic. What remains is the political will.
We don't really need to have the billions of dollars to start taking action. That there is a lot of action at the local level we can take, empowering women, providing training, raising awareness, that we can start with really win-win. How can we do better management at the local level? By just planting some trees, by giving people some improved seeds, so that it's not always waiting till the big money is there.
It's not too late, but we need to act now. For too many years we've observed the march of land degradation and desertification and simply talked about the solutions. The message to policymakers is to invest in their rural areas and to promote the sustainable agricultural intensification which we've been discussing.